present today. Also part of my research on Serbian civil laborers in Nuremberg and around. This is a part of our joint project on forced labor in Serbia. And I'm close to the topic of Serbian workers in Germany with this local approach. Since I'm currently in the middle of my research, this is not final, but my some first conclusions and first insights. Another introductory remark: I will talk about workers in general, but I also include women if I don't mention them directly. Nazi Germany, throughout its area, forced 20 million people to work for their purposes. Over 30 million were transported and used in the Reich itself, and 2.5 million people died during the work, while others worked in occupied areas. Although Germany transported workers from all throughout Europe, more than one half of all forced laborers came from Poland and the Soviet Union. I hope you can see this. I'm still not an expert on Excel sheets. From Serbia up to July 1945, when the last group of workers left Serbia, 64,500 workers were sent to work in the Third Reich. As for statistical data, they're not different for Serbs than for other workers. The majority from Serbia worked in industry, a bit less in agriculture. Although I noticed something, a detail that I could not clarify in literature. For 1942, it says that 26,000 workers worked in industry and 17,000 in agriculture. A year later, the number of employees in agriculture was reduced, according to German sources, by 10,000 workers, and is increased in industry. Why this occurred, I still need to check. The conditions under which foreign workers were used were not based on economic needs primarily, but were compromises among the latest doctrines. This means that the workers were categorized according to race in numerous provisions. For example, the one on Polacks, Polenrasse, regulated duties and prohibitions for certain groups. Some historians grouped according to these regulations. One of the most famous was Mark Spurr, who introduced 6 groups. The first included workers from allied and neutral countries. They had best conditions, although at least on paper they were supposed to get the same amount of food as Germans and fell under the same labor-related provisions. Under Spurr, they were almost equal to the workers from occupied countries of Western, North and Southeast Europe. Serbian workers would, according to him, fall under this category. Karina Bagans, on the other hand, puts workers from the West in the group that had a better position than workers for Southeast, under which she includes Hungarians, Romanians, Slovenians, Greeks, Serbs and Croats, who had better treatment than Polacks and Soviets. The last group were, as always, Jews and Gypsies. It is obvious that these categorizations are problematic because they equalize workers from allied countries and from countries under occupation. One of the aims during research is to more precisely define the position of Serbian workers among all these workers in the Reich. On the conditions of living conditions on workers from Serbia, is very little is known. Unlike Polacks and Soviets, Serbian workers, as you can see in this table, were a small contingent. In addition, Serbian as all other workers were distributed throughout the Reich, so in individual towns, municipalities, factories or camps, there was only a small number of Serbs. These are more or less reason why the destiny of Serbian civilian workers is not included in detailed large or small local studies. Herbert is one of the first of historians that dealt with dealing with the foreign labor force. Notice that there were no papers on Serbian forced workers. In another big paper, Serbian workers only appear on the margins. As one of the many examples for local papers, important for me, is the Zwangsarbeit im ländlichen Franken, forced labor in the rural part of Francia, where Serbs are not even mentioned. My case study is the city of Nuremberg. It's one of the larger German cities with a pretty well-developed industry. In Nuremberg, two big companies, Siemens and MM, and the smaller ones used foreign labor force. Nuremberg was also, for Nazis, one of the most important cities. On one hand, it was a place of Nazi congresses, a political party, proclaiming racial laws in 1936. On the other hand, Nuremberg, with its middle-aged castle and past, was the symbol of connection of the past of the Holy Roman Empire from the First Reich with the idea of the wonderful future of the Third Reich. In the center of the research are those registration booths with the police of the city of Nuremberg. Everyone had to register there. They provide, their documents provide not only an overview of how many people from Serbia were working in the town, but where they lived, who they worked with, whether they could return home or whether they decided to escape. Serbian workers as well as German ones and other workers, except for Ostarbeiters, Jews and so-called gypsies, fell under the labor relations within the civic code. This did not change even after October 1942, when German authorities obligated them to stay and prevented their return home. Later on, they were all turned to forced workers. Labor markets could oblige all workers to stay in Germany if they were not from an allied country. So we can see that Serbs, Greeks were treated worse than the allied countries. When Serbians and other foreign workers got to Germany, they were under the jurisdiction of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront and the Reichsnährstand. This was the administrative institution regulating agriculture. They were first placed in central reception and transit camps, where they went through health examinations. If they had infectious diseases, they went to quarantine. After this, they was distributed to transit camps in the labor market. Whoever needed labor force, individuals, government institutions, private companies, had to notify the labor markets, and then or employment services, and then they were distributed. These companies would then collect their workers and take them to their camps, or if these were individuals, they took them home where they would accommodate them. Foreign workers then, when they came to their place of work and stay, had to register with the police. In the documents of the police from Nuremberg, between 41 and 45, a total of 152 persons, 115 men and 37 women, with for whom country of origin is stated Serbia, and I will go on to call them Serbian workers. But it is important to stress that from the breakup of Yugoslavia, different names were used. Sometimes German civil servants did not know how to call them. Sometimes they were called Serbs if they came from Serbia in transports. But in parallel, documents also refer to Yugoslavs. The case of Nikola M., when he came from Serbia and reported in Nuremberg on 25th September 1941, was put under the category of Serbia, but was called Yugoslav in all documents. Several years later, in 1944, the Croatian consulate in Munich issued his passport. As for age and marital status of Serbian workers in Nuremberg, the situation is following. The eldest worker, she was over 50 when she came to Germany, and the youngest was a girl of 15 who came in July 1943 to Nuremberg together with her mother, where they both worked with the company Siemens. In September already, but several months later, they both returned home. For many, it is conspicuous but not surprising that birth years between 1919 and 1926, usually 3 young men were more than half of all male workers. Out of the men, 50 were married. Out of the women, 22 were married, 2 were widowers, and 15 were single. How did these men and women workers live in Germany? It is very difficult to answer this question, especially looking at the mentioned documents. Having in mind only legal provisions, we could think that foreign workers in Germany were equal with the German workers, but this is of course far from the truth. Nazis always try to use foreign workers only for lower work, especially those help assisting works that nobody would do. So it doesn't surprise that the largest group of Serbian workers in Nuremberg, at least 54 of them, was employed doing simplest works, regardless of what we did in Serbia before. Another group are professionals and craftsmen like metal workers, stone cutters, welders, and so on. Out of the total of 37 workers, 32 of them were doing assisting jobs. One was registered as a simple worker, one was a translator, one was a chambermaid, and there were 2 house keepers. Because they came much more to Germany as non-qualified workers, so they more often did unqualified work. To return to male workers, the most conspicuous group is the 10 bakers that worked around the bakeries in town. Their position was different than the those mentioned so far, by them being accommodated in bakeries, which were family companies, so they did not have to live in the camps for civil workers. It was a similar situation for two hairdressers, one waiter, one agricultural worker, two housemaids, and one chambermaid. As for the bakers, this wasn't specific to Nuremberg. Cordula Tomian, a historian, also mentioned several Serbian bakers who were employed there. Whether they were specialists in Serbia or it was an accident, I could not clarify out of the documents so far, but I hope my research on recruitment in Serbia and dialogue on today's event will help me. I know from the work of Zoran Jenjetovic that the newspaper Novo Vreme looked for builders and carpenters for big construction projects in Nuremberg. My documents show that 15 Serbian workers did for the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Kongresshalle. It consisted out of 3 companies that were doing the construction works on the hall. This Congress Hall was one of the most prestigious buildings of the Nazi Germany. It was initiated in 1935 during the Reichsparteitag annual party meetings. It was never finished. It was supposed to be a Congress Hall during those meetings to serve Hitler and other leaders, give speeches before 50,000 people. Because at the time they had a much smaller hall for that. So this must have been one of those construction projects that workers were sought for in Serbia also. But these types of workers lived in camps outside of the German population, while the bakers lived in the community. This is precisely what Nazis tried to prevent, especially for workers that were on the lower stages of the racial hierarchical level. As I mentioned, the majority of Serbian workers in Nuremberg lived in camps for civilian workers that belonged either to the company they worked for, or they were under the management of the SS. They were sometimes in the buildings that previously served as camps for different Nazi groups. This is one of the examples. Here the workers for the Congress Hall lived. They used rooms, as we can see at the bottom. Photographs were built in 1939 for the same purpose. Only during the early years, German workers lived in them. But as I've said several times so far, this was an exception, not the rule. This was the rule. This is what the standard barracks looked like. There were 2 types, one for men, one for women. The difference was essentially that those for men were a bit bigger. For men for 18 workers and for women for 12 workers. For accommodation doors, using the workers were responsible. There were also controls, but the accommodation for foreign workers was not strictly controlled and was much poorer than in the regulations. And sometimes, rarely, Serbian workers were allowed to live in private homes. This is another propaganda photograph of the interior of the barracks. Sometimes Serbian workers would be allowed to live in private homes. That was the case with Dragomir and Nadezhda Celik, who were as a married couple, came in 1943 to the same employer for Dragomir, who was a metal worker. He worked as a metal worker's assistant. This was his second contract in Germany after he had already been between 1941 and 1942 in Schwabach. Nadezhda, while they were in Germany, got pregnant and had a baby in July 1943, and after this they were allowed to live together, but only 2 years later they deregistered from Nuremberg. She got a certificate that she was no longer fit to work because she couldn't care for the child and work simultaneously, and he was allowed to take them home. They are both lost. It seems they did not return. In the summer of 1944, if there was a possibility to leave Germany, it wasn't desirable to return anymore. It was similar with the Dragomir Bentela, who after their child was born in March 1944 allowed to live together, but these are again exceptions. I will skip a little because I don't have much more time. Legal provisions for workers from Serbia were supposed to get equal medical care as German workers, but in practice they depended on medical insurance, which made very restrictive decisions. If foreign workers were ill, their treatment would last more than 3 weeks. The insurance companies would send them back to their countries and refuse them treatment. It was the same for women who would get pregnant. We can see this practice in Nuremberg. A total of 17 workers were sent home because they fell ill, and as reported, could not be used in the right. The majority of workers, it is possible to see how long they stayed in Nuremberg. There were 20 persons who returned home very fast after 2 to 4 months. Out of those who returned home, out of 29 of them, only 29 of them are reported to have deregistered and went to Serbia. 17 were sent because they were ill, and 7 because they would go to a different place in the Reich. 1 worker did not return from his holiday, 2 died in Germany, and 1 stayed until the end of the war in prison. A total of 37 workers escaped from their place of work. Who they went to, whether they returned or found a new position, we cannot see in the documents in Nuremberg. Both must have happened. And for 39 persons, we do not know what happened with them because we cannot see the deregistration. If I mention the group of bakers one more time who could be assumed to have had better conditions, we must say that it was not so in Nuremberg. Out of 10 of them, 4 escaped and 1 returned to Serbia after 5 months. Only 1, I assume, after completing the first contract, after having stayed in Germany for nearly a year, returned to Serbia and then again to Nuremberg and worked with a different baker, but he left this baker after 5 months because he was, and this is the only trace of this kind, he was called to the army. Maybe somebody here can explain to me what happened there. 1 of them went to Vienna, and for 3 of them we have no data. And to finish quickly, this was just an overview of a part of information I took out of the report reports, registration reports in the archives of Nuremberg. I hope I will find the situation or define the situation of Serbian workers and all foreign workers of the Reich, which still has not been determined. I hope this is the start of the